Hi everyone, I'm Fiona Zabel. I'm a senior at the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, and I did my research in the Carlson Lab at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health on Superfund sites and cognition. So in my talk today, we're going to be answering the questions, what are Superfund sites? What effect can Superfund sites have on human health and specifically cognition? What I did in my study to look at these effects, and what we should be doing in the real world to try and combat these effects in the future. So together, we're really going to be answering, are Superfund sites dementors? Firstly, we want to look at what are Superfund sites. Superfund sites are areas of toxic waste that have been identified by the US government as harmful to human health. So that can mean that they have heavy metal pollutants, something you would think of like lead or mercury, or if they have something more like volatile organic compounds like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which is more what I looked at in the compound category. So you can see a map over on the right of Superfund sites on the East Coast with really condensed areas with lots of sites in them. So if you're looking at the red dots, those are going to be the most extreme of the most extreme, because this is only the national priority list, which is the top tier. And then yellow is going to be slightly less and green slightly less below that. All in all, we have over 1,000 national priority list sites in the US, and these are all sites that immediately need to be handled because they are so hazardous to human health. So I looked specifically at chemicals of concern that were organic compounds that had already been linked with lower cognitive scores in a lab setting. So a large part of my project is looking at when exposed to really condensed areas of pollution with high levels of these compounds that can be hazardous to human health in a lab setting, does that translate in real life? So when you're exposed to a concentrated Superfund site, what effect does that have on cognition? And the proposed mechanism in a lab setting has been that when you're exposed to these chemicals, when they get into your brain, they release chemicals in combination that cause inflammation and numbing in the brain, which can lead to lesioning over time. So firstly, we want to look at what are we looking for in terms of cognition. So cognition, when we're trying to identify it, looks like memory, pattern finding, ability to repeat numbers back to me in a sequence, and complete tests like that. But when we're looking physically, you can see over in the leftmost picture, the normal cognition has intact brain matter, and as you move over to mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's and dementia, that brain matter starts to degrade and we lose some of that in the brain. And we would expect lower cognitive scores as this began to happen, which is how we would diagnose mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. When we're looking in my study specifically, we're looking more for mild cognitive impairment than Alzheimer's and dementia, just due to how severe we think that the impact of exposure will be. So what I have learned from this experience is that people are really, really complicated. And when you're looking at human cognition, there are lots of things you need to take into account because lots of variables can influence people's cognition overall. Some of the main ones that were important to consider were cognitive reserve. So that's the idea that if you have longer term education, you might have a barrier to cognitive loss that other people don't have because of the education that you've received. And this can be important in looking at older adults so we can take into account their years of education, the job that they had, things like that to see where we think they should be cognitively versus where they are. Similarly, we can look at socioeconomic status because access to resources, medical care, to healthy foods, things like that can influence cognition over time as well. Exercise level, the more active someone is, the less likely they are to lose some of that cognition. And sex, women and men on an anatomical level store chemicals differently in their bodies because of distribution of fat. So that would be important to look at too. This is a map of the continental United States, and you can see areas that are red generally have lower median income, and areas that are blue or green generally have higher median income. So we can see that most of the sites are in areas of higher income because they're mostly centered around cities and manufacturing plants and things like that. And this would be counterintuitive because we would think they would be in lower income areas. However, the Superfund sites within these high income areas are in the lower socioeconomic status parts of those cities. Here is a map of Baltimore City, and you can see that almost all of the sites are in southeast or west Baltimore, and there are hardly any in North Baltimore. And as people in the city know, there's stark wealth divides among the city, and so lots of the wealthier areas don't have any pollution in them at all, where it's all concentrated around the bay and in other parts of the city. And if we're looking at this map, we can see that the darker circles of green are more extreme than the lighter circles. So even the severity of the sites becomes lighter and lighter as it approaches North Baltimore. So the questions I aim to ask were, was proximity to Superfund sites correlated or associated with cognitive loss? What would the mechanism for this cognitive loss be if there is an association? And would this be a continuous relationship? So would a low dose over a long period of time have the same sort of effect as a high dose over a short period of time? So I would hypothesize that there'd be a negative association. So as the amount of exposure you have increases, cognitive scores would decline because there would be more of an effect from the site. I think that the mechanism would be accumulation of plaque or of lesioning in the prefrontal cortex, and I think there would be a continuous relationship, so a low dose over a long period of time would likely be a long-term problem. So for methods, I looked at data from the Baltimore Experience Corps and specifically the sub-study, the brain health study, that was data collected by the Carlson lab before I got to the lab. And from that data, we were able to geocode the areas in the city where the participants lived. While I didn't look specifically at their addresses for security and privacy reasons, I was able to see how far away each participant was from however many the closest 5 sites surrounding them were. So this one participant is 5 miles away from the Curtis Bay site, and this other one, and so on. And based on the information, I can identify the pathway that someone was exposed to, which could determine what kind of exposure they had. So for example, if someone is eating food that was grown in contaminated soil, that would look like different contamination than someone who breathed in air from a construction site or something like that. And in order to analyze these data, I was able to use ArcGIS and see what sort of associations there were among the geographic location and exposure based on EPA data. And again, we're looking specifically at chemicals like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated biphenyls, which already have an association with lower cognitive scores in a lab setting. This here on the top is a picture of the Curtis Bay site, and you can see that lots of the plans are very available to the public if you know how to look for them. But I think most people in the city aren't even aware of the number of sites that we have around us, which causes an additional problem because people don't know that they should be protecting themselves. So before I was able to analyze the data, it was important to get to know what participants were like in this data set. So here we have the MMSE scores, or the mini mental status examination scores of the participants across the city. And this test is meant to check on cognition and see where someone is at cognitively. So scores from 30 to 28, that would be pretty healthy. That's really good. From 27 to 25, there's a little bit of concern. Below 24 would be cognitive impairment. So you can see most of the participants in this study are above 28, or 28 and above. So what we're much more interested in is the lower cognitive scores from 24 to 27, and what sort of factors influence that and how that could be possible in these participants. So before I look into what I am what I found in this data, I want to talk about why this is important. So in the current EPA administration, there have been rollbacks in exposure restrictions. So we have people who are being exposed to the same amount of Superfund sites as before. However, the government is classifying that as less hazardous than it previously has. And this is based on data from a study that suggests that there is a threshold linear model for radiation. So a little bit of radiation would be fine for you. Don't worry about it until you get to this level. And while I don't have experience in cancer, I know that this study didn't take into account other possible health risks such as cognition. So a large part of why I think this study is important is because we need to identify whether cognition is something that we should be considering in the first place when we're creating public policy goals and initiatives. Additionally, if we understand why there's some cognitive decline, we can modify our healthcare approaches and create interventions that are helpful to people. So this is especially important because we have a growing older adult population, which means we're going to be encountering more cognitive decline cases than we ever have before. So it becomes really important that we can identify point sources that we can change for whole communities, because we may not necessarily be able to change the brain and provide medicine to everyone in a community. But if we're able to take out a point source of pollution that's hurting that population, then we can change the cognitive outcomes for a whole community, which can be really life-changing if anyone knows the terrible effects that can happen from older adults losing their cognition and how painful that can be. So in this study, it's still ongoing. I haven't found definitive results yet, and I hope to look more into the data set into the summer. However, we didn't see an exact correlation between exposure and cognitive scores. And that's to be expected because, as you saw in the population, most of the population had really good cognitive scores. And so this, even beyond socioeconomic status, which is really speaks to a resiliency in the population. However, when we're looking more at where do we see lower scores concentrated, we can see them concentrated more towards areas with higher pollution. So the next step that I want to take in that is contrasting that with other variables that could be affecting cognition, because there could be some confounding there. And I think it'd be important to look at all the factors that could be affecting that before making any definitive conclusions about that. Additionally, I think it'd be interesting to look into MRI scans to track for mechanisms for this cognitive loss and what pathway would be the most impactful for populations. So for example, is breathing in chemicals much worse than having exposure through the soil or something like that? So all in all, I hope that I informed you a little bit about the Superfund sites in our city and the effect that they can have. And I think that it's really important for us all to recognize the pollution in our city and understand where we're living in, so people can take initiative and modify our public policy for the good of all citizens. But also, if you're living in that area, it's important for you to understand that you may need to take extra precautions that you weren't aware of before. And I think that we all know that knowledge is power, and the more knowledge we can spread, the better it is for all of our populations. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy and has a great rest of their week. Thank you.